Ethan stepped out of the courthouse, his footsteps heavy after a grueling day in court. The case he had just argued was critical, a pivotal moment in his career as a prosecutor, and the sense of victory was beginning to set in. The courthouse steps were slick from the recent rain, and the air was cold, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere, running through the final words he had spoken in the courtroom. He reached his car, parked under a dim streetlight. Just as he fumbled for his keys, Ethan felt a sharp blow to his ribs. His body instinctively crumbled to the ground, the impact leaving him gasping for air. It all happened too fast. He caught a glimpse of two masked figures, one holding a metal pipe, their faces shrouded in darkness. "Stay down," one of them barked, their voice low and menacing. Ethan's vision blurred as pain surged through him. He tried to shield his head, but another kick landed hard on his side. Suddenly, a third figure appeared, smaller, faster, rushing towards the attackers with unexpected fury. Ethan heard the sound of flesh meeting flesh and saw one of his attackers fall backward, dazed. "Get lost," the new figure yelled, the voice surprisingly young yet resolute. The attackers hesitated for a moment before retreating, melting into the shadows. Ethan struggled to push himself up, his vision still fuzzy. As he tried to focus, he saw the face of a teenage girl with tangled hair and intense, wild eyes. "You okay?" she asked, her voice urgent yet concerned. Ethan coughed, wincing as he tried to catch his breath. I'm fine. Who are you?" She looked around nervously, as if expecting the attackers to return. "Name's Ava, and you're lucky I was around," she said, extending her hand to help him up. Ethan hesitated, then took her hand. "I owe you one," he muttered, leaning on her as he tried to steady himself. Ava looked at him with a mix of impatience and curiosity. "Come on, let's get you out of here before they come back." Despite the throbbing pain, Ethan managed a faint smile. "Why did you help me?" Ava shrugged. "Maybe I thought you needed it more than I do." Her eyes were sharp, almost calculating, but there was a hint of something softer, buried deep. Once Ethan was safely inside his car, he turned to Ava. "I don't know how to thank you." "Ava, was it?" She nodded. "You don't need to thank me. Just be careful next time, okay?" But as Ava turned to leave, Ethan stopped her. "Wait, you shouldn't be out here alone at this hour. Let me take you somewhere safe." Ava paused, her expression shifting from defiance to something more vulnerable. "Safe? There's no such thing for me." Ethan could see the truth in her eyes, the kind of truth that only someone who had been through too much could carry. "Then let me try," he said quietly. "It's the least I can do." Ava hesitated again, a wariness settling over her features. But eventually, she nodded. "All right, but just for tonight." As Ethan drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ava was more than just a girl who happened to be in the right place at the right time. There was a story behind her hardened demeanor, a story Ethan was suddenly very interested in uncovering. Ethan parked his car in front of his apartment building, the engine still rumbling as he glanced over at Ava. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, her eyes darting between the streetlights and the shadows that surrounded them. Her guarded expression made it clear that trust didn't come easily. "Here we are," Ethan said gently, trying to break the silence. "It's not much, but it's safe." Ava looked at the building with skepticism. "How safe is safe? Really?" she muttered, her voice low. Ethan sighed. "Safer than the streets, I hope." He stepped out of the car slowly, still feeling the bruises from the attack. Ava hesitated for a moment before following him. Inside, Ethan's apartment was modest but warm. The living room was cluttered with case files, law books, and a worn leather couch that had seen better days. Ava stood in the doorway, looking out of place and unsure of herself. "You can sit," Ethan offered, motioning to the couch. "Or, I can make some coffee if you'd like." Ava shook her head. "I don't drink coffee." Ethan paused, studying her for a moment. "Tea, then? Water?" "Water's fine," she replied quietly, moving further into the room but still keeping her distance. She seemed to inspect everything with wary eyes, as if searching for hidden traps. Ethan returned from the kitchen with a glass of water, handing it to her. "So, Ava," he began cautiously, "what are you doing out there tonight?" I mean, why help a stranger? Ava took a sip of water, her expression hardening. Let's just say I don't like seeing people getting beaten up. And I know what it's like to be outnumbered. Ethan nodded, sensing there was more to her story than she was letting on. I'm grateful, really. But there's another question I need to ask. Where do you usually stay? Her face became impassive, almost rehearsed. Wherever I can, she answered simply. He pressed further. No family? Friends? She scoffed. If I had those, I wouldn't be out there saving people, would I? Ethan wasn't sure how to respond, but he felt a deep sense of obligation to help her. Look, he said, leaning forward, I owe you my life. So, if there's anything I can do. Ava's eyes flickered with a brief moment of vulnerability before hardening again. There is something, she said carefully, but it's not what you'd expect. Ethan's curiosity was piqued. All right, I'm listening. She took a deep breath, as if preparing for a battle. I need you to pretend to be my father. Ethan blinked, taken aback. Your father? Yeah, she confirmed. Just for a while. There's someone after me. Someone dangerous. If I have a father figure, it might make them think twice before coming after me again. Ethan was stunned by the audacity of the request. That's quite a lot to ask, he admitted. Why me? You don't even know me. Ava met his gaze, her eyes burning with an intensity that spoke of desperation. Because you're the only one who's willing to help right now. And I saved your life, so now you owe me. He couldn't deny the logic, even if it was flawed. He leaned back, rubbing his temple. This is crazy, you know that? Maybe, Ava admitted. But it's my only shot. Ethan considered the situation. The idea was absurd, but so was being saved by a homeless teenager. And the bruises from the attack were a reminder that this world wasn't always rational. He sighed deeply. All right, Ava, I'll do it. But just for now, until we figure out something better. Her expression softened for the first time that night, a small, cautious smile appearing. Thanks, she said, almost in disbelief. I didn't think you'd actually agree. Neither did I, Ethan muttered under his breath. The next morning, Ethan found Ava already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with an expression of quiet resolve. So, how does this work? He asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. We need to make it look real, Ava replied. Papers, stories, all of that. Ethan nodded slowly, realizing the gravity of the situation. This is going to be complicated. Ava's voice was barely a whisper. It already is. But before Ethan could ask more, a sudden knock on the door made both of them jump. Ava's eyes widened with fear. Were you expecting someone? She asked urgently. Ethan shook his head. No. But whoever it is, they're not getting in. Ava's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where Ethan noticed the faint outline of a knife handle. I'm ready, she whispered. Ethan looked at her, a mix of concern and admiration in his eyes. Let me handle this, he said firmly, heading towards the door. As he reached for the doorknob, Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline, the uncertainty of what lay beyond filling the air with a tense, silent promise. Ethan paused at the door, his heart racing. He peered through the peephole and saw a man dressed in a worn delivery uniform, holding a package. Delivery for Ethan Hayes, the man announced, his voice muffled by the door. Ethan's shoulders relaxed a bit. Just a delivery, he said, turning to Ava, who still looked ready to bolt. Don't open it, she insisted. It could be a setup. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Stay back, he instructed, before cracking the door open, still cautious. The delivery man handed over a small, unassuming package. Sign here, he said, extending an electronic pad. Ethan signed, keeping his body angled to block Ava from view. Once the door closed, Ava approached slowly, her eyes fixed on the package. What is it? She asked. Ethan examined the return address, which was unfamiliar. No idea, he muttered, tearing open the box carefully. Inside was a thin envelope along with a small, dusty wooden frame. Ethan pulled the frame out first, and Ava's breath caught. That's... she stammered, her voice suddenly fragile. Ethan looked down, his brow furrowed as he examined the photograph inside the frame. It was a black and white portrait of a woman with gentle eyes and a warm smile. "Sarah," Ethan whispered, barely audible. His hand trembled as he traced the outline of the photo. The woman in the picture was his fiancée, Sarah, who had vanished 12 years ago without a trace. Ava stood frozen, her face pale. "You knew her?" Ava's voice was a mix of surprise and confusion. Ethan's mind raced, memories of Sarah flooding back. She was everything to me," he said quietly. He then focused on Ava, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "But how do you have this? How did you know her?" Ava shook her head, stepping back as if the picture had burned her. "I don't know," she insisted, her voice cracking. "I don't remember much about my past, just fragments, blurry faces. But I remember this woman." Ethan's grip tightened on the frame. "Ava, this is not just a coincidence. You were there the night I was attacked. Now this? There has to be a connection." Ava's face hardened again. "I've had this picture since I was little. I never knew who she was. I just kept it." Ethan took a step closer, the shock gradually giving way to something darker, an unsettling mix of hope and dread. "What do you mean, since you were little? How old were you when you got it?" 5, maybe 6, she replied slowly. "I don't know. My memories from back then are just a mess." Ethan's eyes burned with intensity. "That's around the same time Sarah disappeared." The realization hit him like a punch. He studied Ava's face, searching for a resemblance. Her eyes, the shape of her chin. There was something hauntingly familiar, something he couldn't place. "Why would someone send this now?" Ava asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was unsteady, but her eyes were locked on Ethan's, as if she was desperate for answers. Ethan turned his attention to the envelope that had come with the frame. He tore it open and pulled out a letter written in neat, cursive handwriting. "If you want answers, protect the girl. She is more important than you know. Trust no one." Ethan read the letter aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper. Ava's eyes narrowed, her suspicion now mixed with fear. "What does that mean? Protect me from who? And why now?" Ethan folded the letter, his mind spinning. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I promise I'll find out." Ava seemed to struggle with her emotions, her eyes shifting between anger and vulnerability. "You don't have to pretend to care about me," she said bitterly. "If this is about Sarah, just say it." "It's not just about Sarah," Ethan insisted. "I made a promise to you, Ava, and I won't break it. But I need to understand what's really going on here." Ava's face softened, but only for a moment. "If you dig too deep, you might not like what you find," she warned. Ethan stared at her, his determination unwavering. "I'm willing to take that risk." They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Ethan was overwhelmed by the possibility that Ava could somehow be connected to his past, to Sarah, and maybe even to the daughter he had lost all those years ago. That night, as Ethan lay awake in the dark, his mind replayed the events of the day. The photograph, the letter, and Ava's presence. It all felt like the beginning of something bigger, something more dangerous than he had anticipated. He got up and quietly made his way to the living room, where Ava was sleeping on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. He watched her for a moment, his mind grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Who was Ava, really? And was it possible that she was his daughter? He knew he needed proof. His instincts as a prosecutor told him to find concrete evidence, but his instincts as a man, as someone who had loved deeply and lost painfully, told him to hold onto the fragile hope that was beginning to bloom within him. Ava stirred slightly, her face softened by sleep. Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness, a deep need to shield her from the dangers that were undoubtedly lurking nearby. He made a silent vow to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But even as he promised himself to protect Ava, a darker thought crept into his mind. What if Ava wasn't who she seemed to be? What if she was hiding more than she let on? He shook his head, pushing the doubts aside. Right now, Ava needed someone to trust, and Ethan needed to believe that there was still a chance to make things right, even if it meant risking everything he had left. Ethan's office at the district attorney's building was his second home. Case files were piled high, old coffee cups set scattered across his desk, and legal documents were pinned to a corkboard on the wall. But today, as he stared at his computer screen, Ethan's focus wasn't on legal briefs or ongoing trials. It was on Ava. The nagging feeling from the previous night hadn't left him. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah's photograph, held by a girl who claimed to have no memory of her past. Was Ava really connected to Sarah? Was it possible that she was his missing daughter? He clicked away at the computer, his search bringing up articles about cold cases and missing children from 12 years ago. Ava's story, what little she had shared, didn't match up with any official reports. Frustrated, Ethan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Going down a rabbit hole, are we? The voice belonged to Claire, a fellow prosecutor and one of Ethan's few confidants at work. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and a knowing look on her face. Ethan sighed. Something like that. Claire stepped inside, glancing at the screen. Missing persons? That's not your usual workload. Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to share. It's personal, he finally said. I'm trying to find someone who might have been lost a long time ago. Claire's expression softened. This about Sarah again? Ethan's silence was answer enough. She sat down across from him, her tone gentle but firm. Ethan, I know you've never given up hope, but you also need to be careful. You've already lost so much. He nodded slowly. I know, but this time, it feels different. There's this girl, Ava. She saved my life, and now she's staying with me temporarily. But there's something. I can't explain it. She has a picture of Sarah. Claire's eyebrows shot up. Sarah? The same one that vanished 12 years ago? Ethan nodded, his voice tense. The very same. And Ava claims she's had it since she was a child. Claire leaned back, processing the information. That's a lot of coincidence, Ethan. What's your gut telling you? That I need answers, he replied simply. And the only way to get them is to investigate Ava's past. Claire shook her head. You're playing a dangerous game. If you start digging, you might uncover things that hurt even more. Ethan's face hardened. I have to know, Claire, even if it breaks me. Later that day, Ethan returned home earlier than usual, feeling the weight of the investigation. As he entered the apartment, he found Ava sitting at the kitchen table, leafing through some papers she'd found. Old case files that Ethan had left out. You're home early, she remarked without looking up. Yeah, Ethan replied, closing the door behind him. Thought I'd check in on you. Ava raised an eyebrow, her tone skeptical. Check on me? Or check up on me? Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I want to know more about you, Ava. Your past, where you came from. You said you don't remember much, but there has to be something. Ava's gaze turned cold. Why are you so interested? Because of that woman in the picture? Ethan didn't flinch. Yes, but not just because of her. I need to understand who you are. And maybe, just maybe, you can help me understand who I am, too. Ava stared at him for a long moment before she finally spoke. I remember some things. Bits and pieces. There was always a man in the background. Someone who kept me moving from place to place. I think he was supposed to be protecting me, but it never felt that way. Ethan's heart tightened. Do you know his name? She shook her head. No, just that he was always angry. Always afraid of something, like he was running from shadows. Ethan's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. What else? Anything at all. Ava closed her eyes, as if trying to dredge up memories buried deep within. I remember being in a small room, with a picture of the same woman, Sarah. I didn't know her name back then, but I recognized her face. I always felt like I was supposed to remember her, but I never could. The more Ava spoke, the more Ethan felt the possibility of a connection. He struggled to keep his voice steady. Did anyone ever tell you about her? Or mention anything about me? Ava's expression darkened. No, but there was one thing. Whenever I'd ask questions, the man who looked after me would get furious. He'd say things like, stop asking, or they'll find us. I never knew who they were. Ethan's frustration grew. This man, do you know where he is now? No, Ava answered, her voice low. But I think he's still looking for me. The air between them felt heavy, filled with questions neither of them could fully articulate. Ethan's instincts as a prosecutor told him to remain cautious, to approach Ava's claims with skepticism. But his heart, a heart that had been broken and left unhealed for years, told him to trust her. "Then we need to figure this out together," Ethan finally said, his voice determined. "But first, we need proof." "Proof?" Ava asked warily. "Proof of who you are," Ethan clarified. "I'm going to run a DNA test, Ava. It's the only way we can know for sure." Ava's face turned pale. "And if I'm not who you think I am?" Ethan looked her directly in the eyes. "Then we keep looking. But if you are who I think you might be, then we have a lot to catch up on." Ava seemed to process the gravity of what Ethan was proposing. "Fine," she agreed quietly. "But don't expect a happy ending, Ethan." Ethan's eyes softened. "I've stopped expecting those a long time ago." The next day, Ethan called in a favor from a friend in the forensics department to expedite the DNA test. As he waited for the results, he felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with dread. Every ring of his phone made his heart skip a beat. Every knock on the door made him tense. Ava, on the other hand, seemed surprisingly calm, as if she had already resigned herself to whatever fate awaited her. "You really think a test will solve everything?" she asked one evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table. "No," Ethan admitted, "but it's a start." In the days that followed, Ethan found himself torn between his duty as a prosecutor and the deeply personal mission he had embarked upon. He could sense that the truth, whatever it was, would be life-altering. But the uncertainty of whether Ava was really his daughter, of what had happened to Sarah, of the secrets that lay beneath the surface, was beginning to take its toll. Then, one afternoon, as Ethan was sifting through old files again, his phone buzzed. It was a call from the lab. "Ethan Hayes," the voice on the other end asked. "Yes, speaking," Ethan replied, his voice tight. "We have the results from the DNA test," the technician said. "It's conclusive." Ethan's grip tightened around the phone as he braced himself. "Go ahead," he managed to say, his voice low but steady. There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if the technician was choosing their words carefully. "The results confirm a genetic match. Ava, she is your daughter." The words hit Ethan like a tidal wave. He staggered backward, his legs weak as the reality of the moment washed over him. He had spent years hoping, searching, and longing for this very answer, yet he never imagined it would come wrapped in such confusion and danger. "Ethan, are you still there?" the technician asked, sounding concerned. Ethan cleared his throat. Yes, I'm here. Thank you." He hung up, the phone slipping from his hand onto the desk. The room seemed to blur, the air heavy with the weight of the revelation. For a moment, he just stood there, unable to move, as memories of Sarah, the baby girl they had brought into the world together, and the horror of their disappearance flooded back. Ava's voice broke the silence. "What did they say?" Ethan turned slowly to face her. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. He struggled to find the right words, his voice thick with emotion. "Ava, you're my daughter." The shock on Ava's face was palpable. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She stepped back, as if the truth was a physical force pushing her away. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That can't be right." Ethan took a step toward her, his expression a mix of disbelief and desperation. "I know it's a lot to process, but the test was conclusive. You're my daughter." Ava's face crumpled, a mix of anger and sadness crossing her features. "You think I want this? You think I was looking for a father who's a total stranger?" Ethan's heart ached at her words, but he kept his voice gentle. "I'm not expecting you to accept this overnight, but it's the truth, Ava, and I never stopped looking for you. Not for a single day." Ava's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, trying to regain her composure. "If this is true, then what happened to my mom? To Sarah?" Ethan felt a pang of sorrow at the mention of Sarah. "That's what I need to find out. And maybe, together, we can get the answers we've both been searching for." Ava's expression remained conflicted, her voice shaky. "I don't know if I can believe in this. I don't know how to feel about any of it." Ethan approached her slowly, carefully. "Ava, I know it's terrifying, but you're not alone anymore. We can take this one step at a time, but I need you to trust me." Her eyes met his, filled with uncertainty and pain. How do I know you're not just using me to find out what happened to her? Ethan's face tightened, but his voice remained steady. I won't lie to you. I do want to know what happened to Sarah, but more than anything, I want to make up for the years we lost. I want to protect you, Ava, no matter what comes next. The vulnerability in Ava's eyes shifted to something colder, more guarded. You don't know what you're getting into, Ethan. There are people out there, dangerous people, who don't want the truth to come out. They've been after me my whole life. Ethan's resolve only hardened. I'm not afraid of them. I've faced worse. And now that I know you're my daughter, I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Ava's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of her past seeming to press down on her. I don't know how to be someone's daughter, she confessed. I don't know how to be your daughter. Ethan reached out, his hand hovering in the air before gently resting on her shoulder. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it all out, I promise. For the first time, Ava didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a deep, shaky breath and nodded, though her expression remained distant. Okay, but where do we even start? Ethan's mind began to switch gears, moving from the emotional shock to the practical next steps. First, we need to find out more about the people who've been after you. We need to know what they want and how they're connected to Sarah's disappearance. Ava seemed hesitant, but then she spoke up. There's a man, the one who took care of me when I was younger. He always talked about someone called the Overseer. I don't know who or what that means, but it seemed important. He used to say that the Overseer controlled everything, and that they'd stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The Overseer? That's the first solid lead we've had. Did this man ever give you a name? Ava shook her head. No. He was always just the man. He changed his appearance sometimes, dyed his hair, wore different clothes. But he had a scar on his left hand, like a burn. That's the only thing I remember clearly. Ethan made a mental note. All right, that's something. I'll start digging into any connections between Sarah's case and this Overseer. If they're as powerful as you say, it won't be easy. But I've taken down powerful people before. Ava managed a faint smile, though it was laced with bitterness. I hope you're right. Because if you're not, we're both dead. The starkness of her words hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the dangers they faced. But there was no turning back now. Ethan was more determined than ever to uncover the truth, and Ava, despite her fears, seemed ready to face it alongside him. The next few days were a whirlwind of investigations. Ethan spent hours combing through old files, making phone calls to contacts in law enforcement, and following up on any leads related to Sarah's disappearance and this mysterious Overseer. Ava, meanwhile, kept her guard up, but there were moments when she allowed herself to relax. Fleeting moments where she seemed like a normal teenager trying to find her place in the world. One evening, as they were both seated in the living room, Ethan received a call from a private investigator he had hired years ago, one of the few who had never completely given up on Sarah's case. Ethan, I found something, the investigator said, urgency in his voice. There's a name that keeps coming up in connection with Sarah's disappearance and this Overseer you mentioned. It's a man named Victor Kane. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. Who is he? An enforcer? The investigator replied. He's known for working in the shadows, handling problems for powerful people. And the scar on his left hand matches what Ava described. Ethan's heart raced. Do you know where he is? Last known location was a warehouse near the docks, the investigator said. But be careful, Ethan. This guy is dangerous. Ethan hung up, his mind racing. He turned to Ava, his expression grim. I think we found him. The man with the scar. His name is Victor Kane, and he might know everything. Ava's eyes widened with a mix of fear and determination. Then we have to go find him. Ethan nodded. Yes, but we do this carefully. We can't afford any mistakes. As they prepared to leave, Ava looked at Ethan, her voice small but resolute. If this goes wrong, I just want to say that I'm glad I found you. Even if it took 12 years. Ethan's chest tightened with emotion, but he managed a faint smile. Me too, Ava. Me too. With that, they stepped into the night, ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Ethan and Ava drove toward the docks in tense silence. The air outside was damp, a fog creeping in from the waterfront, casting an eerie glow under the streetlights. The clock on the dashboard read 10:47 p.m. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes focused on the road ahead, while Ava stared out the window, lost in thought. "You sure you're ready for this?" Ethan finally asked, breaking the silence. Ava nodded, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. "I have to be. This is our only shot at finding out what really happened." Ethan nodded in return, his face set with determination. He parked the car a block away from the docks, keeping it out of sight. "We need to be careful," he warned. "If Victor Kane really is here, he won't be alone." The two exited the car and moved quietly through the shadows, making their way toward the large, rusted warehouse at the end of the pier. The night was still, save for the distant sound of water slapping against the dock. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This confrontation could finally bring answers, or it could be the end of the road. They approached a side entrance, and Ethan tested the door. It was locked, but not heavily secured. He pulled a small tool from his pocket and began to pick the lock. Ava watched with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. "Where'd you learn that?" she whispered. Ethan smirked slightly, not taking his eyes off the lock. "Sometimes the law has to bend a little to catch the bad guys." With a faint click, the door swung open. Ethan led the way inside, his senses on high alert. The warehouse was dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Stacks of old crates lined the walls, casting long shadows across the floor. Ethan gestured for Ava to stay close. As they crept further into the building, they heard muffled voices coming from deeper within. Ethan motioned for Ava to crouch behind a stack of crates. "Stay low and quiet," he instructed in a hushed tone. Ava nodded, her breath shallow. Ethan moved forward cautiously, his footsteps silent as he approached the source of the voices. He peeked around a corner and saw a group of men gathered in a makeshift office space, their attention focused on a large map spread across a table. At the center of the group was a man with a rugged face and a prominent scar on his left hand, Victor Kane. Ethan's heart raced, but he kept his composure. He slipped back to where Ava was hiding. "It's him," he whispered. "We need to get closer, but we can't let them see us." Ava's eyes widened. "What's the plan?" "We wait for an opportunity," Ethan replied. "If we rush in now, we'll be outnumbered." Just then, one of the men in the group stepped outside to make a phone call. Ethan seized the moment. "Come on," he whispered urgently to Ava. They moved swiftly, closing the distance between them and the office space. Ethan positioned himself behind a stack of crates near the entrance, close enough to overhear the conversation. "I'm telling you, the girl's not going to stop," one of the men said, his voice filled with frustration. "She's already slipped through our fingers twice." Victor Kane's voice was low and menacing. "She's not just any girl. She's the key. If she finds out too much, we're done for. No more mistakes." Ethan's jaw clenched. He could feel Ava's tension beside him, her breathing rapid and uneven. The words confirmed what he had feared. Ava was not just running from these men. She was central to something much larger, something that tied back to Sarah. Suddenly, Ava moved forward slightly, her impatience getting the better of her. Her foot brushed against a loose piece of metal, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. "Who's there?" one of the men shouted, reaching for his gun. Ethan grabbed Ava's arm and pulled her back behind the crates. "Stay down," he hissed. The men scrambled, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Spread out and find them," Victor ordered. Ethan knew they had only seconds before they were discovered. He turned to Ava, his voice urgent but calm. "When I say go, you run. Head for the car. I'll distract them." Ava's eyes were filled with panic. "I'm not leaving you here." Ethan's face softened, but his tone was firm. "You have to. If they catch you, everything is lost." Ava hesitated, her face a mixture of fear and defiance. "I can't lose you, not now." Ethan cupped her face with his hands, forcing her to look into his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Ava, but you have to be safe first. Now go." Tears welled up in Ava's eyes, but she nodded reluctantly. Ethan waited for the right moment, then he threw a small rock toward the opposite side of the warehouse, drawing the men's attention away. "Now," he whispered. Ava bolted, her footsteps as light as she could make them. Ethan watched her go, then turned to face the approaching men. He knew he couldn't overpower them, but he could buy Ava time. He stepped out from behind the crates, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Looking for someone?" he called out, his voice steady. The men spun around, guns trained on him. "Who the hell are you?" one of them demanded. "I'm just a concerned father," Ethan replied, his voice filled with a mix of bravado and determination. Victor Kane's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward. "Ethan Hayes, I presume. You've been a thorn in our side for too long." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "And you've been a ghost for too long, Victor. But it ends here. Where's Sarah? What did you do to her?" Victor's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Sarah was just a pawn, Ethan. You never understood the game. And now you've dragged your daughter into it." Ethan's anger flared, but he kept his voice controlled. "It's not a game when people's lives are destroyed. You took everything from me. I'm not leaving without answers." Victor's smile faded, replaced by cold indifference. "You're not leaving at all." Before Ethan could react, one of the men lunged at him, hitting him hard in the stomach. He doubled over, pain radiating through his body, but he refused to go down easily. He swung back, catching the man in the jaw, but the other assailants were already closing in. Meanwhile, Ava reached the car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. She could hear the sounds of the struggle from inside the warehouse, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she should drive away, get to safety, but she couldn't bring herself to leave Ethan behind. Grabbing a metal pipe from the trunk, she ran back toward the warehouse, determination etched on her face. As she re-entered the building, she saw Ethan on the ground, struggling against two of the men. Without hesitation, Ava charged forward, swinging the pipe with all her strength. The element of surprise worked. She knocked one man to the ground, then turned to face Victor Kane, who was now aiming a gun directly at Ethan. "Drop it!" Victor barked at Ava, but Ava's eyes were filled with rage. "You ruined my life," she spat. "And you took everything from him," Victor sneered. "You don't even know what you're fighting for, little girl." Ava stepped closer, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I'm fighting for the truth, and for my family." In that moment, Victor hesitated, just long enough for Ethan to tackle him. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Ava screamed, but Ethan was unharmed, the bullet having missed its mark. With a final burst of strength, Ethan pinned Victor to the ground. "It's over," he growled. "Where is Sarah?" Victor's eyes were cold, unyielding. "You think this ends here? There are others. The Overseer will never let you rest." Ethan tightened his grip. "I don't care about the Overseer. I care about my family." But Victor only laughed, a chilling sound. "Sarah was gone long before you ever started looking. And Ava, well, you were never supposed to find her." Ethan's heart sank as the implications of Victor's words settled in. But before he could press further, police sirens wailed in the distance. Ava had managed to call for backup before rushing back in. Within minutes, officers swarmed the warehouse, arresting Victor and his men. Ethan and Ava stood side by side, bruised but victorious. Ethan looked down at Ava, his voice filled with a mix of relief and pride. "We did it." Ava nodded, her eyes still wide with lingering fear. "For now. But we both know this isn't over." Ethan put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "No, it's not. But whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Ava leaned into him, finally allowing herself to trust that she wasn't alone anymore. "Together," she agreed, her voice steady. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth and a chance at redemption were within reach. Ethan sat alone in the interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent lights casting shadows across his tired face. It was late, almost midnight, and the adrenaline from the warehouse raid had started to fade, leaving a dull ache in his bruised ribs. Across the table sat Victor Kane, handcuffed and bruised, his expression devoid of any emotion. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but filled with urgency. "You need to start talking, Victor. We have enough evidence to put you away for life, but I need more than that. I need answers about Sarah." Victor remained silent, his eyes cold and calculating. Ethan could see that years of evading the law had made Victor immune to threats or pleas. He was a man who thrived in the shadows, operating without conscience or remorse. Ethan's frustration boiled over. He slammed his fist on the table. "You know what happened to her. You know why she disappeared, and you know who's behind all of this. Start talking, or I swear, I'll make sure you never see daylight again." Victor's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "Do you really think you can threaten me, Hayes? The overseer doesn't forgive mistakes. And you, with your noble sense of justice, are nothing but an annoyance to them." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of the overseer. He had heard whispers of this shadowy figure throughout the investigation. Someone powerful, ruthless, and almost mythic in the criminal underworld. Who was the overseer, really? Ethan demanded. Why did they take Sarah? Why did they keep Ava hidden? Victor's smile widened, as if he enjoyed seeing Ethan's desperation. The overseer is not just a person, Hayes. It's a system. A network of powerful people who manipulate everything from behind the scenes. Business, politics, law enforcement. You were never going to win this fight. Ethan's hands trembled with barely controlled rage. Why Ava? Why was she so important to them? Victor's eyes flickered, a brief hint of hesitation before his usual mask of indifference returned. Ava wasn't just a loose end, Ethan. She was leverage. Sarah found out something she wasn't supposed to know, something that threatened everything the overseer built. Ava was their insurance. Ethan's heart ached at the thought of Sarah, trapped in a world she didn't understand, trying to protect their daughter against a faceless enemy. Where is she now, Victor? Is she still alive? Victor's expression darkened. If you think you can rescue her, you're a fool. Sarah crossed a line, and the overseer doesn't leave loose ends hanging. Ethan's chest tightened. He had feared the worst, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a dagger to his heart. You're lying, he said, his voice shaking with both anger and hope. If Sarah were dead, you wouldn't have kept Ava alive. You still needed something from her. Victor's silence was confirmation enough. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. You're going to tell me where they're keeping her, Victor. And you're going to do it now, before you lose whatever deal I'm still willing to offer. Victor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the small room. Deals? There are no deals with the overseer. Even if I told you everything, you wouldn't make it out alive. They have eyes everywhere, and they've been watching you for a long time, Hayes. Ethan's face hardened. Then I'll take my chances. At that moment, Claire entered the room, her face grave. Ethan, we need to talk. Ethan stepped outside, leaving Victor under the watchful eyes of the officers. What is it? He asked. Claire handed him a folder, her expression tense. We've been digging into Victor's background, and there's something you need to see. He's been involved in several covert operations linked to human trafficking rings, but more importantly, we found this. Ethan opened the folder, his eyes widening at the documents inside. There were surveillance photos of Sarah from just a few months ago, looking thin and worn but alive. This was taken in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city, Claire explained. We think it might be one of the overseer's safe houses. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. She's alive. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice filled with urgency. But if she's there, she won't be for long. They'll move her as soon as they realize we're closing in. Ethan's mind was already made up. I'm going after her. Claire's eyes flashed with concern. Ethan, you can't do this alone. It's too dangerous. Ethan shook his head. I've come too far, Claire. This is my chance to bring her home. I can't walk away now. Back at Ethan's apartment, Ava was pacing anxiously, her nerves raw from the tension of the past few days. When Ethan returned, she immediately sensed the shift in his demeanor. What happened? She asked, her voice filled with both fear and hope. Ethan's eyes softened as he looked at her. They found a lead on your mother. She's alive, Ava. Tears welled up in Ava's eyes, a mix of relief and disbelief. Where is she? An old factory, not far from here, Ethan replied. But we need to move fast. They won't keep her there for long. Ava's face hardened with resolve. I'm coming with you. Ethan hesitated. Ava, this is going to be dangerous. I don't want to put you in more danger than you've already been in. Ava's voice was firm. She's my mother, Ethan. I have to be there. Seeing the determination in her eyes, Ethan nodded. All right, but we have to be smart about this. No rushing in, no taking risks we can't handle. As they prepared to leave, Ava grabbed a small backpack, slipping the photograph of Sarah inside. For luck, she said quietly. They drove in tense silence, the gravity of the situation hanging over them. The factory loomed ahead, a decaying structure that seemed to hold decades of secrets within its walls. Ethan parked the car a short distance away, and they approached the building with caution. The inside was dark and filled with the stench of mold and decay. Ethan moved quietly, his gun drawn, with Ava following closely behind. They could hear distant voices, but it was hard to make out what was being said. Stay close, Ethan whispered. They followed the voices deeper into the building until they reached a large, open space with rows of metal cages. At the center, under the dim glow of a single bulb, was Sarah. She was shackled to a chair, her face bruised and her body weak, but her eyes still burning with defiance. Mom! Ava cried out, breaking free from Ethan's grip. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes widening at the sight of Ava. Ava! She whispered, her voice raw with disbelief. Ethan moved quickly, taking down 2 guards before they could react. He rushed to Sarah's side, his hands fumbling as he tried to undo the shackles. It's me, Sarah, he said, his voice breaking. I'm here. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she looked at Ethan and Ava. I never thought I'd see you again, she whispered. Ava fell to her knees beside her mother, her voice choked with emotion. We're getting you out of here. But before they could move, the sound of footsteps filled the room. A dozen armed men stormed in, guns raised. At the front was a man with a cold, sinister smile, the overseer himself. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice dripping with malice. Ethan stepped forward, his gun still aimed. It's over. We have you surrounded. The overseer laughed. No, Hayes. It's just beginning. The tension in the room was palpable as Ethan, Ava, and Sarah faced their enemies, their resolve unwavering. Ethan tightened his grip on the gun, his eyes locked on the overseer. The man exuded a quiet menace, the kind that came from years of wielding power from the shadows. Ethan's mind raced as he took in the scene. Sarah still shackled to the chair, Ava crouched beside her, and a dozen heavily armed men standing between them and freedom. Ethan's voice was low, but firm. Let them go. This ends now. The overseer smirked, his eyes gleaming with a cold amusement. You're outnumbered and outgunned, Hayes. You've walked right into my trap, like the desperate man you are. Ethan kept his gun raised, unwavering. If you were going to kill us, you would have done it already. You want something, and it's not just revenge. The overseer's smile widened, as if he were pleased by Ethan's words. You're right. You and your daughter are valuable, Ethan. And Sarah, well, she's been a very useful bargaining chip. At the mention of Ava, Ethan's heart tightened. He had to buy them more time, had to find a way out. What do you want then? Money? Influence? We both know you've already got those. The overseer took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. What I want is to maintain control, Hayes. People like me shape the world, not with laws or justice, but with leverage. Sarah was leverage. Ava is leverage. And now, so are you. Ava's eyes blazed with anger as she stepped forward, her voice fierce. I'm not a pawn. You kept me hidden for years, used me as a weapon against my own mother. Why? Why am I so important to you? The overseer's gaze shifted to Ava, and for a moment, his expression was almost admiring. Because you are the perfect embodiment of everything we work for, Ava. Resilient, resourceful, adaptable. Your mother couldn't be controlled, but you were raised by us, trained to survive in ways she never could have imagined. Sarah, despite her weakened state, struggled against her restraints. "Leave her alone," she spat, her voice raw but determined. "If you want me, take me. But let Ava go." The overseer's face hardened, his patience wearing thin. "You're in no position to negotiate, Sarah. You should have stayed out of things 12 years ago, but your stubbornness was always your greatest flaw." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to calculate their odds. There were too many of them, and his gun only had a few rounds left. He glanced at Ava, who was still crouched by Sarah, her eyes filled with a mix of rage and fear. He knew he had to act fast. "Let me make you an offer," Ethan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. "You let Ava and Sarah go, and I'll stay. I'll do whatever you want. Just let them go." The overseer laughed, the sound echoing through the warehouse. "You think I'm foolish enough to trust your word, Hayes? You, who spent your entire career trying to bring men like me to justice." Ethan's face remained impassive, but his voice was filled with resolve. "You underestimate me then. I'm not offering this as a bargain. I'm offering it as a father." The overseer seemed to consider this, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ethan's face. "Touching," he said finally, "but I know better than to take such sentimental offers seriously." Without warning, the overseer signaled to one of his men, who raised his gun and fired a shot that narrowly missed Ava's head. She ducked, her face pale with shock. Ethan's blood ran cold. "Enough games," the overseer said, his voice turning deadly serious. "This is how it's going to go. You're going to put down your weapon, Ethan, or I'll have them both killed in front of you." Ethan's heart pounded, his mind a whirlwind of panic and anger. He lowered his gun slowly, his gaze fixed on Ava. "I'm sorry," he mouthed. But before he could set the gun down completely, Ava's voice rang out, filled with defiance. "No, Ethan, don't give in." With a sudden burst of courage, Ava grabbed the metal pipe she had been hiding behind her back and swung it at the nearest guard, catching him off guard. The man crumpled to the ground, and chaos erupted. Ethan reacted instantly, raising his gun and firing at two of the guards, dropping them before they could react. Ava moved quickly, dodging the bullets that ricocheted off the metal walls. She reached Sarah and began working frantically to unlock the restraints. "Keep going, Ava," Ethan shouted, covering her with rapid gunfire. The overseer, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, yelled at his men to regain control. "Stop them, you idiots!" The remaining guards fired back, forcing Ethan to take cover behind a stack of crates. He felt a sharp pain in his arm as a bullet grazed him, but he ignored it, his focus solely on protecting Ava and Sarah. Sarah's voice was weak but urgent. "Ava, hurry. We need to get out of here." Ava managed to free Sarah's hands just as another guard charged toward them. Ava swung the pipe again, this time with more force, knocking the man down. Sarah, though weakened, managed to stand, leaning heavily on Ava for support. Ethan saw an opening and made a desperate move, tackling the overseer to the ground. They struggled violently, punches and kicks exchanged with brutal force. The overseer managed to break free and aimed a knife at Ethan's chest, but Ethan caught his wrist just in time, redirecting the blade away. "You think you can win this, Hayes?" The overseer snarled, his face twisted with rage. "You've already lost everything once. I'll make sure you lose it all again." Ethan's voice was filled with raw determination. "Not this time." With a surge of strength, Ethan twisted the knife from the overseer's grip and shoved him backward. The overseer stumbled, momentarily disoriented. Ethan used the moment to grab Sarah and Ava, his voice urgent. "We have to go now." They ran toward the exit, the sounds of gunfire and shouting echoing behind them. The three of them burst out of the warehouse and into the cold night air, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Ethan guided them toward the car, parked a short distance away. But as they reached the vehicle, a gunshot rang out. Ethan felt a sharp, searing pain in his side and stumbled, barely managing to stay on his feet. "Ethan!" Ava screamed, her face filled with horror. "I'm okay," Ethan gasped, though the pain was excruciating. "Get in the car." Sarah helped him into the back seat as Ava started the engine, her hands shaking but steady enough to get them moving. The car sped away from the warehouse, leaving the chaos behind. In the back seat, Ethan clutched his side, trying to keep pressure on the wound. "It's not too deep," he assured Sarah and Ava, though his voice was weak. Ava's eyes were filled with tears, but there was also a fierce determination. "We're not stopping, Ethan. We're going to find somewhere safe." Ethan managed a faint smile. "We did it, Ava. We found her." Sarah, her voice filled with emotion, looked at Ethan through tear-filled eyes. "You came for me. After all these years, you really came for me." Ethan's voice was soft but filled with conviction. "I never stopped looking, Sarah. Not for a second." As the car drove into the night, Ethan knew the battle wasn't over. The overseer was still out there, and the threat loomed larger than ever. But for the first time in years, they were together as a family. And that, for now, was enough to keep them moving forward toward whatever dangers and revelations awaited them next. Ethan, Sarah, and Ava drove through the quiet outskirts of the city, the tension finally easing as they distanced themselves from the chaos of the docks. The adrenaline of the escape was wearing off, replaced by exhaustion and the weight of everything they had been through. Ethan, still clutching his wounded side, struggled to stay alert, his vision blurring slightly. Ava glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her voice filled with urgency and fear. "You're bleeding too much, Ethan. We need to get you to a hospital." Ethan shook his head weakly. "No hospitals. It's too risky. The overseer has people everywhere." Sarah turned to him, her eyes filled with concern. "But Ethan, you're hurt. We can't just keep driving like this." He met Sarah's gaze, his voice steady despite the pain. "We can't afford to be found, not until we have a plan." Ava's face was set with determination. "I know a place. It's not far from here. We'll be safe there, at least for a little while." Ethan nodded, trusting Ava's instincts. She drove in silence, navigating the dark streets until they reached a small, run-down motel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, which made it perfect for hiding. Inside the cramped room, Sarah helped Ethan lie down on the bed, his breathing labored. "I'll get some supplies," Ava said, her voice firm but laced with worry. She rushed out, returning minutes later with bandages, antiseptic, and a bottle of water. "Let's take care of that wound," Sarah said, her voice gentle but resolute. She carefully lifted Ethan's shirt, revealing the bullet wound, which was deep but not life-threatening. "This is going to hurt," she warned as she began cleaning it. Ethan winced but managed to smile faintly. "You haven't lost your touch, have you?" Sarah's eyes glistened with tears, but she remained focused. "Neither have you," she whispered. Ava stood by, watching them with a mix of relief and uncertainty. "Will he be okay?" she asked, her voice small. "He'll be fine," Sarah assured her, though the worry was clear in her eyes. "But he needs rest." As Ethan drifted into an uneasy sleep, Ava sat down next to him, her expression unreadable. I never thought I'd have a family," she admitted quietly to Sarah. Sarah wrapped an arm around Ava, pulling her close. "We're not whole yet," she said, her voice filled with determination. "But we'll find a way." The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of Sarah and Ava talking in hushed tones. He felt a dull ache in his side, but managed to sit up. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice rough. Sarah looked at him, her face tired but determined. "We need to bring the overseer down. It's the only way we'll ever be truly free." Ethan nodded slowly. "But we'll need proof, solid evidence that links him to everything he's done. Otherwise, he'll slip through our fingers again." Ava's eyes lit up with a sudden realization. "The safe house where they kept me, there were files, documents. I remember seeing them when they moved me around. If we can find those, it might be enough to expose everything." Ethan felt a surge of hope. "Then that's our next move. But we have to be smart about it." The next few days were spent planning meticulously. Ethan called in a few favors from his contacts in law enforcement, people he knew he could still trust. Meanwhile, Ava and Sarah gathered information on the possible locations of the overseer's safe houses, cross-referencing everything they could remember. Finally, they identified a location, an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of the city, rumored to be a stronghold for the overseer's operations. It was risky, but it was their best chance to gather the evidence they needed. The night of the raid arrived, and the three of them prepared in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the mansion, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the familiar rush of adrenaline mixed with a deep sense of purpose. "Stay close," he whispered to Ava and Sarah. "We're getting in and out as fast as we can." They slipped through a broken side gate and made their way into the mansion, moving silently through the dark corridors. Ethan led the way, his gun drawn, while Sarah and Ava followed closely behind. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the halls. "I knew you'd come, Hayes." The overseer stepped into view, flanked by two armed guards. His face was calm, almost amused, as if he had anticipated this moment. "You really think you can bring me down with a few documents?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Ethan's voice was steady, filled with resolve. "It's over, overseer. We have everything we need." The overseer's eyes flickered with anger. "You're a fool, Ethan. Even if you kill me, others will take my place. You can't stop what we've built." Ava stepped forward, her voice filled with defiance. "You used me, tried to break me, but you failed." The overseer's gaze shifted to Ava, his expression unreadable. "You're stronger than I expected," he admitted. "But strength means nothing without power." Before Ethan could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air outside. His backup had arrived. "You're done," Ethan said, his voice cold and certain. The overseer's face twisted with rage. "You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over." The armed guards moved to attack, but Ethan and Ava acted swiftly. Shots were fired, and in the chaos, the overseer tried to escape. Ava pursued him, her movements quick and precise. She caught up to him in a darkened hallway, blocking his path. "It ends here," she said, her voice steady. The overseer glared at her, his face contorted with hatred. "You think you're free now, Ava? You'll always be running, just like your mother." Ava's eyes were filled with a quiet, fierce resolve. "No," she said simply, "not anymore." With a final, decisive move, she disarmed him, her training and instincts taking over. The overseer fell to the ground, defeated. Moments later, Ethan and Sarah reached Ava, relief flooding their faces. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with concern. Ava nodded, her face pale but determined. "Yeah, it's over." The police arrived soon after, securing the mansion and arresting the overseer and his remaining men. As they were led away in handcuffs, Ethan, Sarah, and Ava stood together, the weight of the moment sinking in. "It's really over," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with both disbelief and hope. Ethan put his arms around Sarah and Ava, pulling them close. "We did it," he said softly. "We're free." In the weeks that followed, the evidence collected from the mansion was more than enough to expose the overseer's network, leading to arrests across the city and beyond. Ethan returned to his work, but this time with a new purpose, not just as a prosecutor, but as a father determined to protect his family. Ava slowly began to adjust to a new life, one where she wasn't constantly running. It wasn't easy. Years of fear and mistrust didn't vanish overnight. But with Ethan and Sarah by her side, she found hope in the possibility of a real future. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Ethan, Sarah, and Ava sat together on the porch of their new home, a small but cozy house that felt like a true beginning. Ethan looked at Ava, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Ava smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her face. "I had to be, but I'm not alone anymore. And that makes all the difference." Sarah leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, her voice soft but filled with contentment. "We're finally a family." Ethan's heart swelled with emotion, the long years of searching and suffering finally giving way to peace. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "We're a family, and no one will ever take that away from us again." As the darkness settled in, they sat in silence, knowing that the past would always be a part of them, but that it no longer defined them. They had found each other, against all odds, and that was all that mattered.